Masechet Nazir Daf Mem Gimel. Today we're going to talk about the prohibition of a Nazir and a Kohen to become Tameh Lamet. That's one thing that they have in common, and anything that we say about Nazir will apply to Kohen and vice versa. So whatever we're going to learn from both contexts, and so it doesn't matter which context you learn it from. All right, so now both a Nazir and a Kohen cannot become Tameh for most people, pretty much anyone. A Kohen, however, has exceptions. A Kohen can become Tameh for their 6 close relatives, and then also his wife, so 7 close relatives, she's added as well. A Kohen Gadol, however, cannot become Tameh for anyone. A Nazir is like a Kohen Gadol. A Nazir cannot become Tameh Lamet, not even for close relatives. All right, so with that in mind, we're going to be looking at these sources to answer 2 questions. On the first Amud, we're going to talk about, can a Kohen or a Nazir go into a room with a Goses, someone who's on their deathbed. They may die at any moment. So is that permitted, or do they have to worry that this will also cause tum'ah or be prohibited to them? And on the other side of the daf, we're going to ask about, what if it's not a whole body? What if it's just a limb? Can a Kohen become tameh to bury a limb of a close relative? Is that sufficient? Also causes tumat met, or does it have to be only if it's an entire body? All right, so we begin. Tenor Banan, lehechalo ad sheyamut. Rabbi Omer b'motam yitama ad sheyamut. So we have Tanakama and Rabbi who seem to be saying the same law, but they're deriving it from 2 different places. The Tanakama says lehechalo teaches us that a Kohen is not prohibited until the person actually dies. If they are on their deathbed and they're near death, it's still permitted for a Kohen to be there. So let's see the context where we learn it from. Vayikra 21, talking about a regular Kohen who cannot become Tameh Lamet, but is permitted for their mother and father and son and daughter and brother, and also a sister who was never married, la yitama. And then it adds lo yitama baal be'amav lehechalo, and a kinsman cannot become tameh that will lehechalo, to profane himself. So this word lehechalo, and maybe the rabbis are relating it to the word halal, which halal means a dead body. So the person only becomes tameh if they are lehechalo, meaning with a dead body, someone who was declared finished, and not if they're on their deathbed. Then that does not cause tum'ah, that is not profaning himself, and so that is therefore permitted. All right, so that's Tanakama, learns it from the Hechalo. Rabbi, however, that's a Biyuda Nasi, learns it not from Vayikra 21 about a Kohen, but rather from Bimidbar 6, which is about a Nazir. So let's look at that context. Here it says, he cannot, a Nazir, nefesh met lo yavo, and not even for his father and mother and for his brother and sister. Lo yitama lehem b'motam. Even when they die, he cannot be kam tameh, because nezer elohav al rosho. And then, okay, so from here you see that it says lo yitama lehem b'motam. The prohibition is only b'motam, when they are actually completely dead. But then lo yitama. But what if they're not yet dead, and even if they're on their deathbed, then it's permitted, but they're not tameh, and so there's no prohibition, there's no tum'ah. A Nazir can go and visit their relatives or anyone, even if they're on their deathbeds. Okay, so that's the 2 opinions here, and now we're going to have 2 interpretations of this baraita. My benaihu, is there any difference between Tanakama and Rabbi? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, mashma'oto shin ika benaihu. Rabbi Yochanan says there's no practical difference. It's only about the meaning of their interpretations. Is it better to interpret it from here or better to interpret it from there, right? Which is a better derivation. But there's no practical difference. They would agree that Nazir and Kohen can be with someone on their deathbed, and there's no prohibition until the person is actually dead. That's Rabbi Yochanan. Resh Lakish amar, goses ika benayhu, leman damar melehechalo afilu goses, leman damar b'motam, al sheyamut in, goses la. However, Resh Lakish says there is a difference between them, and that is someone on their deathbed. According to the hechalo, that's Tanakama that learned the lehechalo. Lehechalo is a more general word, right? To profane himself. That means even if they are on their deathbed and the Kohen's going to go there, that's already profaning himself by being near death. The person is, right, this Kohen is near a person who is near death, and that is already profaning. We're going to talk about in a second, does that actually cause tumat met? We're going to say no, there's no actual tumat met, but the prohibition of a Kohen being with them, touching them, being in the same room with them, already applies because the hechalo. Whereas according to the Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, he learns from bimotam. Bimotam is a very clear word until he actually dies. Then there is a prohibition. But if he's on his deathbed, then there is no prohibition. Okay, so that's a completely different explanation than the Rabbi Yochanan. I mean, the Rabbi Yochanan seems to be the peshat because they both say ad sha'ah sheyamut, and this is ad sheyamut. So it seems to be till he dies, although maybe you could infer this Rabbi says ad sheyamut, when he actually dies. Ad sha'ah sheyamut is at the time of death, meaning there is a prohibition even at the time of death. So maybe this word here, sha'ah, does in fact support Resh Lakish's opinion. Okay, so we're going to go with Resh Lakish for now in the following discussion, and we're going to ask a few questions based on Resh Lakish. Okay, so to summarize, let's keep Resh Lakish in mind and assume his interpretation. According to Tanakama, a Kohen and a Nazir, whatever applies to one applies to the other, is prohibited from even being with a goses on his deathbed, whereas Rabbi Yehuda says a Kohen and Nazir are permitted until the actual moment of death. Good. Now, assuming that there is a difference between them, we're going to ask why they didn't use the other interpretation. According to the one who says melehechalo, that's Tanakama, but it also says regarding a Nazir b'motam. What are you going to do with that pasuk, Tanakama? And they'll say mi ba'aleh kedirbi the Tanya Rabbi Omer b'motam eno mitame ava mitame b'nigam b'nigatam u'bezivatam. Oh, he needs that for the B's reading. Ironically, the B is the other opinion after Tanakama. So the Tanakama will agree with the way the B uses that very pasuk that the B is bringing. Okay, the B we're going to see is going to use this pasuk for two things. Now, what did the B say about this? That b'motam, a Nazir and a Kohen, cannot become tameh lamet. That's the only prohibition. But other types of tum'ah, they are permitted. If there's a nega, leprosy, or a ziva, right, a abnormal discharge, those are also types of tum'ah that are pretty serious types of tum'ah. And a nazir and a kohen is permitted to become tameh if they need to. If it happens to them, they don't really have a choice, or if they have to touch someone who is a zav or zava, so that is permitted. Only tumat met is prohibited, and so that's what he's going to do. With he's already using Tanakama is already using b'motam for that. All right, then let's turn around. Ulman damar b'motam hami ba'ele haisebara. The one who says b'motam, that was actually the B. What is he going to do with this, who is also the B? So actually doesn't point it out in the Gemara, but it's actually we're asking the B about something else the B said. Im ken, so the B will answer. Im ken lemakera b'mot. My b'motam shemat mina terte. The pasuk really could have said b'mot. B'motam, making it plural, means that we can learn two things from this pasuk. We can learn, number one, that the prohibition only sets in when the person actually dies, but on the deathbed is permitted for a Kohen and Nazir to be with them. That's one thing we learn. And the second thing we learn is that the prohibition is only about tumat met, but other types of tumah is permitted. Okay, so now the B is good. Now, ulman damar b'motam haketib lehachalo. Now, sticking with the B, hey, you have the word b'motam, but what are you going to do with the other pasuk lehachalo that was said regarding a Nazir? a Kohen, right? Lehechalo is said regarding a Kohen. What are you going to do with that pasuk? It's extra. So we'll answer Lehechalo lehachi udata b'mi she'eno mechulal yasa zeh shemechulal ve'omed. Lehechalo comes to teach that this is only for someone. The prohibition is only someone who is not profaned, meaning a Kohen or a Nazir who is tahor cannot become tameh. But if the Kohen was already tameh lamet, and then they wanna go touch another corpse, then there's no prohibition, right? If you remember, this was the opinion of the Ra'avad, even though everyone, Rambam and everybody else disagrees, so that's not halacha l'maaseh, but you see this would be the source for that, lehechalo, only if it would profane them, but if they're already profaned, then it's permitted. Okay, now Tanakama, they use milehechalo to teach that one cannot even be with a goses. Well, don't you need it for this also? Don't they agree with this? And you need to learn this teaching as well, that he can become tamet a second time. Oh, the pasuk could have said just lehachel, a simpler way, but having an extra letter there, the more complex word lehechalo, we can actually learn two things. So in the end, both Tanakama and Rabbi agree agree on the other laws that we learn from this, that a Kohen and a Nazir can become tameh for sarat and for zav and zava, and also that if they're already tameh, they can become tameh again. So they agree with all those laws. It's just a question of, and they learn it from the same places. But now those two pisukim, which one are going to use for double duty? And so Tanakama will use the lehechalo for double duty, and therefore derive that it's prohibited. He's more stringent, prohibited for a Kohen Nazir to be with a goses. Whereas Rabbi says, I'm going to use bemotam for double duty, and that means the prohibition is only when they die, but it's permitted to be with a goses. Okay, good. And so now last question in this series. Metibe, Adam eno mitame ela al sheteseh nafsho, va'afilu meguyad va'afilu goses. Here we have a braita that seems, a Mishnah in Ohalot. That seems quite clear, and it says a person does not become tameh until they are actually die. Even if they are cut up, lacerated, there's a bullet wound, and it's clear that they're going to die. Even if they're on their deathbed, no tumat met until they're actually dead. So that's the braita. And now a question, according to Tanakama, within the interpretation of Resh Lakish, of course, who says, who learns it from lehechalo. So how could you say that it's prohibited for a Kohen and a Nazir to go to a person on their deathbed? After all, you just says here in the Braita that they do not have tumat met. The person on his deathbed does not cause tumat met. So why should it be prohibited? And his answer would be, Linyan tamuye ad nafka nafshe. Linyan et chole ha'itchil. Yes, you're right. Regarding tumat met, until the person's soul departs, they do not cause tumat met. And so that's not the problem. But regarding profaning, it is still profaning the Kohen and the Nazir to even enter into the room with or touch the goses, even though they're not dead and they don't cause tumat met, still it's profaning and therefore prohibited. And so that resolves that problem. Okay, now that ends that discussion of the goses, and now we have a section that's going to get a little bit gory. So here we go. Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Rav. Okay, this is the statement of Rav Chisda. This is going to be the subject of this whole line of questioning. Nikta rosho shel abiv eno mitame lo. Even though a Kohen is permitted to become tameh lamet for his father, but if his father's head was severed, then he's not a whole body, he cannot become tameh lamet for him. My tama, what's the source? Amar kera le'aviv, bizman shehu shalem v'lo bizman shehu haser. Only because it says le'aviv, for his father, meaning for his father as a whole. Only if he's a whole, if his body is fully intact and he died, then a Kohen can become tameh lamet to bury his father. But if he's missing a limb, a head is a pretty important limb, then that's not his father is not whole, and therefore cannot become tameh lamet. Okay, I don't know why they're discussing this. Did this happen often, even theoretically? But okay, anyway, this is Rav's derivation. Okay, Amar le Rav hu amnuna, ela me'ata ka'azil befakta, ta'arbot ufsaku gannabe, lereshe, hachi nameh de la lim tameh le. So Rav Hamnuna is going to challenge Rav Chisda and say, wait, according to you, let's say a Kohen and his father are walking in this valley of Aravot. It's a place, there's no man's land, and there's a lot of bandits there. And so robbers come and they take the guy's father and cut off his head. That's what these bandits would do. And so now what is he going to do? They run away. Now the Kohen is left there. You can't tell me that the Kohen can't bury his father because his head is severed. What are you going to do? Just leave him there in the middle of the desert? Right? Does that make sense? Amar le met misva ka'amart hashta yesh lomar ba'harini michayav ba'aviv lo kol sheken. So Rav Chisda says this falls into the category of a met misva. A Kohen is permitted to become tameh lamet for anyone if they are met mitzvah, a dead person that's in the middle of nowhere. There's no one else to come and bury him. There's no relatives. There's nobody else who's not a Kohen. And so he has to do it. So yes, you're right. He cannot bury him in terms of the law of burying a father, but the Kohen would be permitted as a met mitzvah. Okay, if the met mitzvah is true for anyone else, all the more so for his father. Now we ask about that. V'hai met mitzvahu v'atanya ezehu met mitzvah kol she'en lo korbin. Kobrin. Korev acherim onin oto en ze met mitzvah. Wait a second, this doesn't fit into the definition of met mitzvah. Braita says, what is a met mitzvah? Someone who has no one to bury him. That if they would call and someone would say, hey, look, there's a person, this person died, and nobody would answer. Meaning, there's no relatives, right? If someone would answer, say, you make an announcement, right? Mr. So-and-so died, and then people would come and say, oh, that's my relative, right? I'm responsible for the burial. Responsible means either they do it themselves or they pay for it. A son would have to use money if they can't do it themselves, to have to pay for it. And this person who died in the desert and his head was cut off by bandits, he has a son. So it's not called a met mitzvah if he has a son, right? And if the son is a Kohen and he can't do it, even though he's a son, he can't do it because the father's head is severed, but he would have to pay for someone else to do it. So it's not called a met mitzvah because there is a son who is responsible. If someone calls, he will answer and say, yes, that's my met, and I am responsible to bury him. So you can't apply the law of met mitzvah. And the answer is, no, we're not talking about it's happening in the city. If it was in the city, and let's say the same thing, his head cut off, so the son would not be able to bury him as a father because it's not whole. But it's not a met mitzvah because the son is there. It's not nowhere land. So in that case, the son would have to go and spend money and hire someone else who's not a Kohen to bury his father. But if you're talking about when you're in the middle of nowhere, there's nobody else around that he can go and hire. So then it is a met mitzvah, and that would be true for anyone who's there, who's found in the desert. There's nobody else there. This guy would be permitted. So all the more so for his father. Okay, good. So we answered that challenge. Now another challenge against Rav Chisda. Metibe la yitama la hu mitame ve'eno mitame le'ebareha. So now a similar law regarding a sister. For a sister, it says a Kohen can become tameh. For a sister who was never married, la, to her, yes, yitama, he can become tameh. So this word la is extra. Just say yitama. For a sister who was never married, yitama. What's this la? It means only if she is there whole, but not for a limb. If for some reason her limb was amputated or something, and it needs to be buried, even the limb needs to be buried, the Kohen brother is not permitted. And we're going to compare the sister also to the father. Aval mahazir hu al esem kisora. And the reason why we're saying this about the sister is because it's also the same thing about the father, that a Kohen cannot become tameh for a limb from the living body. There's ever minachai, is when a limb is cut off, like an amputation. There's also ever minamet, if somehow a limb gets severed after the person dies. The Kohen cannot become tameh for a limb from his sister or from his father. But here's something he can do. So far, that's consistent with what Rav Chisda said. But the last part is problematic for him. Here it says he can look for a small bone that's the size of a barley grain. A small bone the size of a barley grain is big enough that it imparts tum'at met. And so the halacha here is saying that if a Kohen already became tameh for his father, right? Let's say his father was mostly whole, but maybe there was a small bone that was not yet gathered, and needs to be searched for. And so if the Kohen, who was permitted to, already buried his father, but then he wants to look, maybe there was a crime scene or something, and there might be a small bone that also should be buried, that even though it will cause tumat met, that's permitted. Now, my mahazir hu al esem kisora lav lememradi mehasar purta. Now, what does this mean? That he can go and look for a small bone? Doesn't that mean that when the father died and he was buried, he was missing a small part, and that means the father was not actually whole, and yet the Baraita assumes that it was permitted for him to go and bury the father in the first place, even though he was missing a small part. Well, it doesn't matter how small, how big, right? He's missing, doesn't matter if it's a whole limb or a head or a small part or a small bone. Still, he was not whole. Now, according to Rav Chisda, you said Kohen can only become tameh to bury his father's whole. And according to this, even if the father is missing a bone, it's permitted for him to bury him, and then go ahead, since he's tameh met already, he can go ahead and look for the small bone. So, with Rav Chisda, how are you going to answer that? And he says, la hahi Rabbi Yehuda. That is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. I don't agree with that. I follow the other Tanaitic opinion. Well, what does Rabbi Yehuda say? The Tanya. Rabbi Yehuda omer, la mitameh, ve'eno mitameh le'ebareha, she'eno mitameh al ever min hachai shel abiv, aval mitameh hu le'ever min hamet shel abiv. Rabbi Yehuda said, from the same word regarding a sister, to her, he can become tameh, but not for a limb, because a Kohen cannot become tameh for just a limb from a limb cut off from while alive from the father. But he can become tameh for a limb from the dead body of his father. This baraita means that, according to the Yehuda, a Kohen cannot become tameh for a limb of his father that was severed. Let's say his arm is amputated while he's alive. The Kohen cannot touch that arm and cannot bury it. The Yehuda would agree with that. However, if his father died, and for whatever reason there's some limb missing or a bone missing, then he's permitted to become tameh to look for the bone, and that assumes that he was already permitted to bury the father. And so therefore you see, according to the Yehuda, a Kohen is permitted to bury his father even if the father is missing a limb. And that is the opposite of what Rav Chisda said in the name of Rav. So this baraita over here that says, yes, he's permitted to bury his father and then go look for a bone, that was following the opinion of the Yehuda, who is more lenient and permits such a thing. But that's only opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and Rav Chisda doesn't follow it. Okay, another challenge. V'hatanya Rav Kahana beRabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov la mitameh ve'eno mitameh le'evarim perat lekezait min hamet vekezait netzel umelo tarvad rakav. So this baraita says that from the same thing, from the word for a sister, it says la mitameh, a Kohen can become tameh for his sister, but that's only if it's a whole body, and not if it's just limbs, and that will exclude a kezayit of solid parts, or a kezayit of liquid fluid that came from the corpse, or a spade full of dust from the corpse. All those Kohen would not be permitted to go and bury. So only if it's an entire body, and not if it's a limb or just these small just these pieces. The Kohen cannot become tameh to bury those pieces. Now, what about something in between? Yachol lo yitama l'shidra v'lagulgolet ro binyana or ro minyana ketiv amarta alehem hosif lecha katuv tuma acheret. Okay, what if it's not just this a little bit of a kezayit? What if it's the skull, the spine, and the skull, or most of the skeleton, or the majority of the number of bones, right? So it's not just a little piece, this is a major part of the body. So could it be that a Kohen would not become tameh for that? No, Kohen can become tameh, because the pasuk says va'amarta lahem. So this is back to Vayikra, where it introduces by saying here, v'amarta lehem. Why do you have to add this v'amarta lehem? It's an inclusive phrase, and so that's coming to include that not only in a whole body, even if it's a major parts of the body, the Kohen also becomes tameh for a relative. What you see here is that as long as the majority of the bones are there, even if it's missing many of them, as a minority of them, a Kohen does become tameh. This is a challenge to Rav Chisda, because Rav Chisda said, if it's missing even one limb, then Kohen cannot become tameh. So the Baraita continues and says, Yachol lo yitameh l'shidra v'lagulgolet ro binyano shel acherim. And so now, what about can a Kohen not become tameh for a skull, a skeleton and skull, and the majority most of the skeleton, or the majority number of bones for other people? Amarta ma choto miuchedet shegufa talui bo umitameh l'shidra v'gulgolet ro binyana af kol shegufo talui bo mitameh l'shidra v'gulgolet ro binyano ulrov minyano. So now we know this law regarding his sister, but what about for others? The other relatives, right, would be the same thing, that the son a Kohen, can become tameh for the skeleton or majority of the skeleton of his parents or son or daughter. So we say, just like regarding a sister, where the body is dependent upon him, the brother has to tend to her burial, and he is permitted to become tameh for her skeleton and skull, or for the majority. So too, for any of the other close relatives, where that Kohen is responsible to bury them, they are permitted. So we see from this that this baraita, right, assumes that a Kohen is permitted to become tameh as long as it's a major part of the skeleton, even if it's missing one, even if it's missing a bunch of limbs, it's permitted. And this is against Rav Chisda. So we answer, Hahi nameh Rabbi Yehuda. That baraita is also Rabbi Yehuda, right? Rabbi Yehuda is the one that said it's permitted as long as most of it's there. Ve'Rav de'amar ki haytana de'tanya ma'aseh shemet aviv shel Rabbi Yitzchak beginzak. ובא והודיעו לאחר 3 שנים. ובא ושאל את רבי יהושע בן אלישע ו40 זקנים שעמו. ואמרו לאביו בזמן שהוא שלם ולא בזמן שהוא חסר. And so the Rav Chisda, Rav Chisda, in the name of Rav, when he said his halacha that Kohen cannot become tameh unless it's a full body, and if it's missing any parts at all, it's permitted for a Kohen to become tameh. He is rejecting, he does not follow the Yehuda, and that's okay, because he has another Tana to follow, and that would be the Tana of the following Baraita, of a story that one time Rabbi Yitzchak, his father, died in Ginzak, a faraway place. We don't know exactly where it is. You can look here to see some identifications. Anyway, his father died in some faraway place, and he didn't hear about it for a while, and they came and told him 3 years later. And then Rabbi Yitzchak went and asked Rabbi Yoshua ben Elisha, who was with 4 other elders, and they discussed it. And the question was, can he go and tend to the burial of the father? Now, it was 3 years past, so I assume that there was some kind of burial. But in the olden days, they used to do a double burial. They would bury someone on a shelf in a cave, and then they would come back about a year later when the flesh disintegrated. They would take the bones, gather the bones, and put them into a smaller jar or a box. And so he wants to know, can he go and tend and do the second burial for his father? And they answered, Le'aviv, no, you're a Kohen. A Kohen is only permitted to become tameh for his father who is whole, but not if he's missing. And after 3 years, the body is not whole anymore. The flesh is gone. And so, no, sorry, you cannot do that. Even though there's a full skeleton there. So according to the Biyudah of those baraitot, it would be permitted. But you see from the fact that they said it's prohibited, they disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, and so this baraita shows support for Rav Chisda that only if the body is whole, but if it's missing any pieces, then the Kohen is not permitted to become tameh lamet. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.